In the scorching desert of ancient Mesopotamia, one of Rome's most powerful men met a death so gruesome that its echo haunted the empire for generations. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, built his fortune on the suffering of others, only to learn that greed, pushed to its extreme, becomes its own executioner. This is the story of how gold, the source of his power, was transformed into the instrument of his most horrific demise. The year was 53 BCE, and Rome's hunger for conquest was at its peak. Three men ruled the known world through a fragile alliance: Pompey the Great, Gaius Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus. While his allies forged legends through military triumphs, Crassus faced a humiliating truth. He was seen not as a warrior, but as a banker among soldiers. His immense wealth, amassed through real estate speculation and slave labor, secured political influence, but not the respect he desperately craved. Crassus watched as Caesar conquered Gaul and Pompey dominated the Mediterranean, their victories resounding in Rome's marble halls, while his own achievements were measured only in profit margins. The barbs of mockery, calling him the third wheel in the Triumvirate, stung incessantly. At 60, most would have been content with wealth, but Crassus saw only one path to true glory: a military conquest that would eclipse the successes of his illustrious allies. The Parthian Empire beckoned like a golden prize beyond Rome's eastern frontier. Stretching from the Euphrates to India, this vast kingdom controlled lucrative trade routes for silk and spices, linking east and west. Crassus convinced himself that conquering Parthia would bring not only military fame, but also unimaginable riches, gold and silver to dwarf even his fortune. The Senate, wary of his ambitions, refused to sanction a formal declaration of war, but Crassus pressed forward regardless. In 55 BCE, he arrived in Syria as governor and immediately began preparations for a grand invasion. He dismissed warnings from local commanders familiar with Parthian tactics, deeming them cowards. Desert kingdoms had always fallen to Roman discipline and engineering. Why should Parthia be different? His confidence was bolstered by intelligence suggesting internal strife at the Parthian court, making them vulnerable to a decisive strike. Crassus assembled a massive army, 7 legions, nearly 40,000 soldiers, supported by 4,000 cavalry and an equal number of light infantry. It was one of the largest expeditionary forces Rome had ever sent east. Among his officers was his beloved son, Publius, a seasoned warrior who had distinguished himself under Caesar in Gaul. His heir's presence gave Crassus added motivation. This campaign was to establish a dynasty of military glory. The invasion began in the spring of 53 BCE, when Roman forces crossed the Euphrates at Zeugma. Early successes seemed to validate Crassus's confidence. Local settlements either surrendered without resistance or quickly fell to Roman siege tactics. The flat Mesopotamian terrain was ideal for Rome's heavy infantry, and early reconnaissance suggested that King Orodes II of Parthia was distracted by internal rebellions, leaving the border lightly defended. However, Crassus's early victories were part of a carefully orchestrated Parthian strategy. General Surena, the young commander of the Parthian forces, deliberately lured the Romans deeper into the desert, away from their supply lines, and into terrain favorable to Parthian cavalry, but deadly for Roman infantry. The few skirmishes were tactical withdrawals, designed to instill false confidence in Crassus while exhausting his army with grueling marches under the blistering sun. As the Roman army ventured deeper into the Mesopotamian desert, the true nature of their enemy began to reveal itself. The Parthians were not the disorganized barbarians portrayed by Roman propaganda, but a highly sophisticated military power with centuries of experience waging war in the harsh conditions of their homeland. Their army was built on mobility and ranged combat. Heavy cavalry, cataphracts, delivered devastating charges, while light horse archers struck from impossible distances, remaining beyond the reach of Roman weapons. Surena's strategy, the young but brilliant Parthian commander, exploited every weakness in Roman military doctrine. Where Romans relied on tight formations and engineering superiority, the Parthians emphasized speed and flexibility. Where Romans expected battles to follow a predictable script, the Parthians favored attritional skirmishes and constant harassment. Most critically, where Romans anticipated a decisive clash, the Parthians deliberately avoided direct engagement, slowly bleeding their enemy through relentless attacks. The psychological warfare was no less sophisticated. Parthian scouts appeared on distant ridges, just visible enough to be noticed before vanishing before pursuit could be organized. Supply caravans were ambushed by unseen enemies who melted into the endless sands. Sleep became a luxury. Sentries reported strange sounds and movements in the night, plunging the entire army into a state of exhaustion and paranoia. Crassus began to realize that traditional Roman tactics were useless against this new kind of warfare. His heavy infantry, invincible in the forests of Europe and the Mediterranean coasts, suffered under the heat, terrain, and unconventional methods of the enemy. His own cavalry, hastily assembled for the campaign, was inadequate for mobile warfare, and his supply lines grew increasingly vulnerable to Parthian raids that seemed omnipresent and elusive. The critical moment came at the city of Caria, a small settlement in northern Mesopotamia where Crassus decided to make his stand. The local geography seemed favorable. Hills provided cover for the infantry, and a nearby water source addressed supply concerns. Intelligence reported that Surena's main forces were approaching, and Crassus saw a chance for the decisive battle he believed would justify the entire campaign and prove Rome's superiority. The Battle of Caria began at dawn on the 9th of June, 53 BCE. The Roman forces arrayed in their traditional formation, heavy infantry at the center, cavalry on the flanks, and light troops screening the main force. Crassus took position at the center, while his son, Publius, commanded the right wing of the cavalry. In the morning light, the army looked magnificent. Banners gleamed, armor shone, a pinnacle of Rome's military machine. But Surena's approach revealed the true power of Parthian strategy. Instead of a conventional battle formation, the Romans faced something they had never seen before, a purely cavalry-based army moving across the desert like a single living organism. Heavy cavalry, clad in shimmering scale armor, formed the core, while thousands of horse archers swirled around it like streams of water, creating a constantly shifting tactical picture that Roman commanders could neither predict nor counter. The battle opened with a massive volley of Parthian arrows that darkened the sky above the Roman lines. Unlike previous enemies who quickly exhausted their ammunition, the Parthians had organized a supply train of fresh arrows, ensuring a relentless barrage. This was not a battle, but a grinding annihilation. The Roman shields, designed to deflect spears and swords, proved useless against the relentless barrage of arrows that continued hour after hour without respite, steadily eroding the legion's morale and fighting capacity. Publius Crassus, young and impetuous, eager to prove his valor, made a fatal mistake. He broke formation and led the cavalry wing in a headlong charge against the Parthian center. This was exactly what Surena had anticipated. The heavy cavalry, cataphracts, absorbed the charge, while the horse archers enveloped the Romans, cutting them off from the main army. Trapped and attacked from all sides, Publius's cavalry was methodically annihilated, within sight of his father and the rest of the Roman force.
The death of Publius marked the psychological breaking point of the battle. The Parthians severed the young man's head, mounted it on a spear, and paraded it along the Roman lines as Crassus, frozen in horror, watched the spectacle. The sight of his son's head swaying above the enemy ranks shattered Crassus. The general who had crossed the Euphrates in triumph was reduced to a broken old man, incapable of issuing clear orders. Roman discipline began to crumble. The reality became unbearable. They were trapped, surrounded by an enemy who could strike at will while remaining out of reach. Water was running out. The wounded outnumbered what the medics could handle. Every attempt to break out led to more losses. The desert, once seen as the path to glory, had become a prison without escape. As night fell, Crassus attempted to organize a retreat to the nearby city of Carrhae, hoping its urban terrain would neutralize the Parthian cavalry's advantage. But the withdrawal turned into a rout. Exhausted Roman soldiers discarded their equipment and abandoned discipline, desperately seeking safety. Thousands were killed during the chaotic night march. Others succumbed to heat stroke and fatigue, left behind by comrades who could barely save themselves. The remnants of Rome's great eastern army staggered into Carrhae at dawn. Having lost nearly half their number in a single day, the proud legions that had crossed the Euphrates were reduced to a mob of battered survivors. Their standards were lost, their confidence shattered, their commander broken by grief and the scale of the catastrophe. Crassus had gotten the decisive battle he craved, but the outcome was catastrophic. Instead of finishing the enemy with an assault, Surenna displayed Parthian magnanimity. He sent envoys under white flags, proposing a parley between commanders to discuss terms for a Roman withdrawal. The offer seemed reasonable. Both sides had suffered losses, and the Parthians had proven their strength. For Crassus, desperately trying to salvage some remnant of his army, it was a glimmer of hope, a faint chance to avoid total ruin. The meeting was set on neutral ground between the armies. Both sides were to arrive with small retinues of officers. Despite warnings from his subordinates, who suspected a trap, Crassus agreed. His desire to end the nightmare outweighed his judgment. He wanted to believe some honorable outcome was possible, that his great gamble had not ended in the complete collapse of Rome's ambitions and his own destruction. What happened next is a matter of debate among ancient historians, but the outcome was clear. The parley turned violent. Parthian warriors seized the Roman delegation.
Whether it was deliberate treachery or the result of mutual suspicions remains unknown, but Marcus Crassus found himself a prisoner of the man who had destroyed his army and killed his son. The wealthiest man in Rome was now entirely at the mercy of enemies who had every reason to despise everything he represented. Surenna's treatment of his captive reveals the depth of Parthian fury toward Roman ambitions. Crassus was not merely a defeated general who could be ransomed or swiftly executed. He became a symbol of everything the Parthians despised about Roman expansion. His invasion was unprovoked, an act of aggression driven solely by greed and ambition, launched without respect for Parthian sovereignty or the lives sacrificed for his personal glory. The decision to execute Crassus in a manner befitting his character and crimes reflected not only the Parthian sense of justice, but also their profound understanding of symbolism. In a culture where honor was measured by deeds, not wealth, Crassus embodied everything contemptible in Roman values. His death was meant to send a message, not only to Rome, but to any future conqueror who dared view Parthian lands as easy prey. The chosen method was both practical and deeply symbolic. Molten gold, the metal that defined Crassus's life and drove his catastrophic invasion, would become the instrument of his death. Parthian craftsmen heated gold to a liquid state, transforming it into a substance capable of searing human flesh while retaining its allegorical power.
The man who worshipped gold above all else would now experience its true nature: beautiful yet deadly, valuable yet destructive. The execution took place before the Parthian nobility and captured Roman soldiers, serving as both a judicial act and a public spectacle. Crassus was forced to his knees, with soldiers holding his mouth open, denying him the chance to speak or plead for mercy. The molten gold was poured slowly, maximizing suffering and turning the execution into a spectacle that would be remembered and recounted for centuries. The physical pain was unimaginable. Liquid gold, heated to over 1900 degrees Fahrenheit, burned through his mouth, throat, and internal organs while Crassus remained conscious. But equally significant was the symbolic message. The man who worshipped gold above all else, who built his fortune on exploitation and violence, now experienced gold as a destructive force. His worship of wealth became his literal curse. Eyewitnesses described Crassus's final moments as a grotesque parody of his lifelong ambitions. The mouth that spoke of conquest and glory was filled with the metal he had chased across continents. The throat that delivered speeches about Rome's destiny was scorched beyond recognition. The body that reveled in luxury became a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked greed and ambition. The repercussions of Crassus's death reverberated across the ancient world, far beyond the military disaster. News of the execution reached Rome within weeks, sparking panic among the ruling class, who suddenly realized that the eastern frontier was not secure, and that their enemies possessed not only the strength, but the will to inflict humiliating defeats on Roman arms. The myth of Rome's invincibility, carefully cultivated through centuries of expansion, was shattered in the Mesopotamian desert. The political fallout in Rome was immediate and severe.
The triumvirate that had long shaped Rome's political destiny collapsed. Pompey and Caesar were no longer allies, but rivals. Without Crassus's wealth and influence as a counterbalance to their ambitions, the two remaining titans began political maneuvers that would soon lead to civil war and the demise of the Roman Republic. The irony is stark. In death, Crassus unwittingly set in motion the conflicts he had sought to avoid through his eastern campaign. The Parthians' treatment of other Roman prisoners revealed that Crassus's execution was not an act of wanton cruelty, but part of a calculated strategy, a warning to future aggressors. Many surviving soldiers were resettled in remote regions of the Parthian Empire, where they founded communities and gradually assimilated. These former Romans became living examples of Parthian mercy toward those who did not choose war, a sharp contrast to the fate of their commander, who instigated the conflict. The symbolic weight of Crassus's death reverberated across the ancient world, inspiring artists, writers, and philosophers for generations. The image of molten gold poured into the mouth of Rome's wealthiest man became a potent metaphor for the dangers of excessive materialism and unchecked ambition. Plutarch, writing over a century later, used the execution as a moral lesson on the corrupting influence of wealth and the inevitable consequences of hubris. Modern historians continue to debate the details of Crassus's death. Some question whether the story of molten gold was literal or an allegory, but its historical significance is undeniable. The execution marked a turning point in Rome's eastern expansion, demonstrating that the empire's enemies wielded not only military prowess, but also sophisticated psychological warfare. The Parthians' treatment of other Roman prisoners revealed that Crassus's execution was not an act of wanton cruelty, but part of a calculated strategy, a warning to future aggressors.
Many surviving soldiers were resettled in remote regions of the Parthian Empire, where they founded communities and gradually assimilated. These former Romans became living examples of Parthian mercy toward those who did not choose war, a sharp contrast to the fate of their commander who instigated the conflict. The symbolic weight of Crassus's death reverberated across the ancient world, inspiring artists, writers, and philosophers for generations. The image of molten gold poured into the mouth of Rome's wealthiest man became a potent metaphor for the dangers of excessive materialism and unchecked ambition. Plutarch, writing over a century later, used the execution as a moral lesson on the corrupting influence of wealth and the inevitable consequences of hubris. Modern historians continue to debate the details of Crassus's death. Some question whether the story of molten gold was literal or an allegory, but its historical significance is undeniable. The execution marked a turning point in Rome's eastern expansion, demonstrating that the empire's enemies wielded not only military prowess, but also sophisticated psychological warfare. The Parthians' treatment of other Roman prisoners revealed that Crassus's execution was not an act of wanton cruelty, but part of a calculated strategy, a warning to future aggressors. Many surviving soldiers were resettled in remote regions of the Parthian Empire, where they founded communities and gradually assimilated. These former Romans became living examples of Parthian mercy toward those who did not choose war, a sharp contrast to the fate of their commander who instigated the conflict. Archaeological finds from the Carrhae battlefield continue to reveal the scale of the disaster. Weapons, armor fragments, and remains all testified to the utter destruction of a professional army. These artifacts tell the story of a force annihilated by an enemy that understood not only the tactical terrain, but also the psychology of war. Roman military doctrines were revised after the defeat, but the damage to the empire's prestige was irreparable. The legacy of Crassus's death shaped Rome's foreign policy for decades. Subsequent emperors approached Eastern campaigns with greater caution and respect for Parthian military traditions. The catastrophe revealed that Rome's enemies were not merely barbarian tribes to be subdued by discipline and engineering, but sophisticated civilizations with their own strategies and martial cultures. This realization marked the beginning of a more mature phase of Roman expansion, where diplomacy began to complement brute force. The story of Marcus Crassus remains an enduring cautionary tale about how personal ambition, unchecked by wisdom, can lead to catastrophe affecting entire civilizations. His journey from successful financier to military tragedy illustrates how individual flaws can alter the course of history. The molten gold that became his executioner remains a powerful symbol. What we desire most passionately can become the instrument of our destruction.
In a world where inequality and the thirst for power continue to shape history, the death of Marcus Licinius Crassus stands as a grim reminder of the price paid by those who mistake wealth for greatness. His journey was not one of ascent, but of a fall disguised as triumph. He amassed unimaginable riches, but failed to gather wisdom. He conquered cities, but could not conquer himself. True leadership demands more than gold and legions. It requires foresight, compassion, and the ability to see consequences beyond victory. Crassus ignored warnings, failed to recognize limits, and did not understand when enough became too much. And so, in the sands of Parthia, where Roman arrogance met Eastern resolve, his voice was silenced, not by a sword, not by words, but by molten gold poured into his throat, a symbol of the greed that became his curse. This was not merely an execution, it was a ritual. It was a verdict on an era where wealth became an idol, and power an end in itself. The golden throat that silenced Rome's richest man continues to whisper through the centuries. It speaks not of Crassus, but of us, of everyone who strives for the summit while forgetting that height without foundation is a fall. It reminds us that power without responsibility is tragedy, and greed without measure is death cloaked in gold.